Welcome to City Talks, where we discuss the big issues facing UK cities and the latest thinking on urban policy with expert guests. I'm your host, Andrew Carter from the think tank Centre for Cities. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to this edition of City Talks. Today my guest is Jas Barsi, who's Head of Corporate Affairs at SSE. We're going to be talking about cities, net zero, green energy, and particularly reflecting on what's changed since we published a report 2 years ago looking at these issues. When we published Accelerating Net Zero Delivery in September 24, we argued that UK cities had a critical role to play in the energy transition, but they needed more powers, more funding and more capacity to turn national ambitions into change on the ground. Obviously, a lot has happened since then. We've seen significant changes to devolution, with stronger powers for mayors and more flexible funding through integrated settlements. Planning policy has shifted with a much bigger emphasis on density and urban development. Bus franchising has expanded, and there's been progress on retrofit and standards for new homes. Great British Energy and the local power plan have also put local energy much more firmly on the agenda. In other areas, including heat network zoning, progress has been much slower. Perhaps the biggest change is in the nature of the conversation. The question is increasingly about not what is green energy and do we need it, but actually how do we deliver it? Over the past few months, we've been exploring that question through a series of roundtables with cities and organisations involved in the energy transition. And today we want to bring those conversations together to look at what has changed since 24, what cities are telling us about the reality of delivery, and what needs to happen next. Guys, welcome to City Talks. As I said, we've been working together on these issues for the past couple of years. Let's just start with your perspective on what's changed, as I say, since we published the report back in 2024.
Thanks, Andrew, and Centre Cities for having me. I guess if I reflect back since we did the Accelerating Net Zero Delivery report, I think there are probably three things that have changed since then. One being, with the energy transition, we're in a new phase now, a new phase focused on electricity and electrification.
Yeah.
The case for that has never been much clearer. We are moving towards an economy where, think about our consumers, citizens and businesses will be powered by electricity. The National Energy Systems Operator projects by 2050 electricity demand will more than double. And why does that matter? Well, that matters because this transition is going to change how we heat our homes, move people and goods, how businesses can be powered and consume energy. And that brings me to my second point, which is, I guess, cities and places sit at the nexus of this transition. And I think since we embarked on the report, I think the role of cities and places have become more central to that delivery conversation. This transition isn't going to be one in lofty the target is going to be on the nitty-gritty and delivery. In city regions where housing, transport, skills, energy demand, planning, investment skills, things will all come together. But I guess the third bit, and we'll obviously unpack this a bit, the conversations move down the funnel from ambition to delivery. The difference now, local leaders know what they want to achieve. The question is how. How do they build the capability, capacity, and investable pipeline to make these projects happen at pace? Things that, us as SSE, we're a clean energy champion, investing 33 billion for next year in the UK's clean energy infrastructure and to enable electrification. These are the kind of building blocks we need to give us the confidence to invest.
Yeah. And it's been interesting, I think. We're talking in mid to late August, where we've had extensive and continuous sort of heat waves where, how we live, has very much come to the fore, which, that in itself, I think, just crystallizes some of the issues about, and particularly, given lots of people live in and work in cities, how they function is critical, that and the energy aspects associated with that. I think the other thing which is interesting, again, your reflections on it, very clearly, maybe it was there 2 years ago, but certainly there here now, is not just thinking about the green energy transition, for example, as a means by which we produce and consume energy, but actually as a vehicle to help us through the next phase of economic development. Actually places thinking about what that means
Yeah.
from a jobs perspective, from a skills perspective, from an investment perspective, and really seeing that this transition process gives them a way to move from what they were and what they are to what they're going to need to be. And I think that's been a central theme in a lot of the conversations that we've been having.
100%. I think that's absolutely spot on. That focus on those outcomes, societal outcomes. How do we, want to enable economic growth? What does that mean in terms of good jobs? Thinking about the government's mission of good growth in every postcode, but then what are the building blocks we need to make that possible? How do we have the right skills pathways? If we're cleaning up our transport systems, what does that mean in terms of air quality? And if we're going to be moving to a clean power system with electrification, what does that mean in terms of reduced bills? Those outcomes, I think that focus on outcomes to win the political argument in case of the transition. It's become absolutely more important in the conversations we've had around the country. And, as I say, cities and places really sit at the nexus and the heart of those outcomes and are the enablers.
Yeah,
So-
I think I was going to say, just to expand on that and get you, to talk a little bit more about that, the role of cities as in the first instance, a sort of a platform,
Yep.
a thing, a place,
Yeah.
a scale at which we can draw some of these different agendas together. Because we know historically that, doing that at the national level can be problematic for a whole bunch of different reasons. Departmental infrastructure is one of those reasons, but others. But actually at the place level, at the city scale, that gives us the way to think about energy alongside transport, alongside housing, alongside investment. Actually bringing those together, that actually means we can make progress on the ground, but actually we can make sense of it on the ground, not just for stakeholders, but actually for consumers and for citizens more broadly.
Absolutely. And if I reflect a bit on the report, when we started on this journey a couple of years ago, it comes back to that argument around density, right? And, whether it's how we move, whether it's how we power, whether it's how we heat, whether it's how we do our planning, cities as places of density, are an untapped asset, a critical enabler to enable this transition to happen, right? And I think what's really interesting now is, since we've had the report, the conversation has shifted. Do local leaders need to act? Yes. They've gone on the journey. They've put net zero targets, clean energy targets in place. They've developed local area energy plans. Okay, they've got a sense of what they need to do. Now the next phase is how do they do that? What is the organizing principle around place? What is the organizing delivery architecture they need to put in place to deliver these plans? And I think that, what's been interesting about the conversations, obviously you and I have had over the past year or so, is in some respects thinking about those challenges that's consensus, but also not. And I think with obviously the new government in place, they've, the cabinet statement we saw last month, I think it was, with number 10 North, etc. We'll come back onto that. And there's a real focus now that if we're going to drive good growth in every postcode, you've got to make cities and places the organising principle for delivery and delivering that growth. And how do we put that? What does that delivery architecture look like? I think becomes really critically important.
Yeah, and in terms of the sort of capacity question and the the deliverability question, what's your take on, when you think about what that is? You can think about that in lots of different ways. We talked about and explored questions about whether there's a skills issue. Literally, do the mayoral combined authorities, for example, have the skills internally to be able to make this into something that is actionable? There's a skills question in relation to the workforce. Do we have the workers in places to actually facilitate and enable the transition towards the green options that we want? We talked about in other sessions about the funding and the investment question, not just the availability of money. And when you think about the wealth fund and what's going on, National Wealth Fund and what's going on there, not just the availability of money, but actually the type of money and the degree to which it is prepared to co-invest and under what conditions. Just again, and what we
Mm.
particularly struck by when we think about that sort of capacity to shift from vision to strategy through to action on the ground. Where do you think we are? Where do you think some of the blockages might be? I guess from a SSE perspective, you're in that sort of space in a very particular way as well. So it'd be just interesting to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as SSE over the past few years, we've worked really intensely with mayoral strategic authorities to engage on their local area energy plans, and mayoral strategic authorities like Greater Manchester Combined Authority and West Midlands Combined Authority, and through collaborating on their local area energy plans and understanding their energy needs and what they might need of a strategic partner or infrastructure provider such as us to deliver a retrofit, district heat network, EV charging points, solar. I think what's been interesting through that journey, if you think about the conversations, there's no shortage of capital, both public and private, to catalyze this transition. I think what is missing, as I say, I come back to that point around the delivery architecture. Is actually the capability, and the capability, let's kind of color the house, as it were. I think what, point one, perhaps we can explore, I think actually it's a lack of capability and capacity. That's probably as important, more important, and the bigger blocker to delivery than, is the capital there? If I reflect, one of the first conversations we had, particularly focusing on the government's mission on Clean Power 2030. Now, mayoral strategic authorities, will have climate environment officers, but they will not be staffed in the way that, say, DESNZ or other parts of Whitehall are. And, we can come on to Number 10 North and what they're trying to do there. But putting that, development a bit, perhaps for later down the conversation, even if you take the more advanced mayoral strategic authorities like GMCA and West Midlands Combined Authority, they don't have significantly large teams. So there is a choice of prioritization. Prioritizing, you've got a target, you've got a mission to decarbonise power system by 2030. What are you going to, their mayors will have targets. What are you going to prioritise? Are you going to prioritise a district heat network? Or are you going to prioritise, which may take 15, 20 years, some challenges over the economics to make that commercially viable, longer term payback versus perhaps solar, where you can get a quicker win, thinking about putting that over, residential estate, new build, council, social housing, where you perhaps get some quicker wins. So, what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that the capability, is meaning you're getting that prioritization, and that is meaning some parts of the energy system are being pushed greater than others. I think that's probably the first. But I don't know what that chimes with some of the reflections.
No, I think it definitely does. And as you say, I think it's an interesting sort of process of going from, as you say, from the grand ambition or the strategy to then both what's the suite of options available, and then allied with the capacity available to take those options forward, which options are, should be enacted, or which options should be prioritized, because you won't be able to do everything all at once. And also, as you say, the payback or the return period, the impact period is going to be noticeably different in some places more than others.
And just another further build on that. Again, even if you take the most mature mayoral strategic authorities, and I keep referencing GMCA, but as a case in point, got a multi-year funding settlement, got a very comprehensive local area energy plan, was the template, if you like. You look at their 5-year environment plan, some significant targets on decarbonising a power system, including solar, district heat. But if you look at the progress they've made on the transition, yes, they've made progress in cleaning up transport with, buses under public control. But actually on the areas like solar and others, delivery story is somewhat, weaker, which I think highlights the capability challenge. Even if the most mature mayoral strategic authorities are having to prioritise, those that are at the beginning of that journey, as I say, of putting together local energy plans, ultimately that is going, that's always going to be one bit of the bottleneck.
Yeah. Do you think what's your sense as to the varying progress that we've seen? Do you think that, in a sense, this is partly a timing question? That if we wait a couple of years, we'll see all of these things progress just because time is past, or do you think what's your sense that there are particular blockages or particular issues, either at the local level or indeed at the national level, that will need to be addressed and need to be introduced in order for progress to either start to happen or to quicken? Are we just at a point in time and we'll see more progress come what may, or do we need to do some specific stuff in order to get to unlock some of the opportunities so we do see progress?
Yeah, so I think we're at a really interesting point in time, Andrew, where I think politically, both for the government that came into office in 2024 and now, I guess, new sort of administration, at the political level, the realization is that we're at a really interesting inflection point with local growth plans, a clean power mission, local power plans, that all of these things should be entwined, uh, and there is a opportunity for cities and places to be the engines of local clean growth, local clean infrastructure. I think, at the mayoral and political level, the sort of realization of this opportunity is there, and in various bits of policy, take GB Energy, and there is a recognition of that ambition. However, at this point in time, I think with business as usual, we're probably not on track to quite realize that potential. And so if I take GB Energy, as an example, I guess again, keep coming back to Manchester, don't I? But if we think about, solar, at a national level, GB Energy has an investment plan, a local power plan, with several billions attached to roll out solar via community energy groups, working with industry, mayoral strategic authorities, to deliver distributed energy infrastructure. And the route to do that is through mayoral strategic authorities as the delivery partner. If we take Manchester as an example, Manchester's local area energy plan, 7% of some of the non-domestic buildings are public sector, which is something like 2.5 gigawatts of solar.
Right.
Coming back to my point, if you want to catalyze some of this stuff quickly, whether it's for us or other providers, question is, what is the right funding mechanism and arrangement to make this investment happen quickly? I don't think we've quite nailed that.
No.
What is the right procurement model?
Yeah.
How is the risk? And we had this in the conversation with the Wealth Fund. How does the risk best sit between the mayoral strategic authority, is GB Energy or the Wealth Fund, or for us as a private developer that wants to perhaps roll out solar, offer technical expertise, or do retrofit to public buildings like libraries or hospitals or universities, etc. I don't think we've quite at the level down worked out.
And why do you think? Why do you think that is? What is it? Is that because it's relatively new, Jazz, or do you think it's that there isn't the impetus to? Because I think there is impetus to do it. There isn't, and the ambition is not just a lofty ambition, warm words, but no commitment to doing it. And I agree with you on all the things that you've said, as sort of thinking through the mechanics of this. And it doesn't mean it's going to happen everywhere all at the same time. And we'll probably need some places to be at the vanguard in order to learn from, and then to modify and help the roll-up. But I'm interested. Why do you think that? Or what will make that happen? Because I agree with you. Like on the funding side, we haven't quite figured out where the risk sits and what the funding model is and what's the co-investment requirements. I don't know. It's a big question, because if we had the answer, we'd be undoubtedly doing it. But it's an interesting sort of space, right, to think about.
It's a really challenging one. It's one that for us as a leading clean energy infrastructure provider, grapples with. I think one of the key challenges is perhaps we don't have from a public policy perspective, perhaps the right test bed to enable that experimentation. If I think back to the conversation we had with the Wealth Fund, at the moment, perhaps this is a legacy of PFI in a sense,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We had PFI. Let's not go perhaps down the road of that too much. And there were some successes, but there were some challenges, right? And I think what we've got is we've got initiatives like the Net Zero Accelerator pilot. We've got institutions now like the National Wealth Fund and GB Energy, but they're kind of on the public finance side. And then you've got us here, private finance side. I think what we perhaps haven't figured out is what are those, what are the sort of pilots type schemes? If we take my solar example, there will be, GB Energy has a local platform, but through DESNA's working with Treasury and these institutions, what potential pilots could there be that, I think enable that they give mayoral strategic authorities that confidence to take risk? Because in the conversations that you and I had, they recognise they can't do this. They can't do this alone. They need to partner with the private sector.
Yes.
The will is there. The desire is there to invest. We've had many conversations as well, sat around the table.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the crunch, it's that who's going to take the risk? Where does it best fit? So actually, is the role of public policy to create some test beds to perhaps do that? I mean, perhaps drawing on other examples of other sectors outside of it.
No, I think you make a great point. And actually, I think your sort of historical reflection or reference to PFI, I think is very apt because it's undoubtedly left a sort of negative legacy in getting into longer term contracts for good reasons, but ultimately create some problems. And then what I think it does, it builds or it results in a reluctance to then think about how we do that, because you don't want to get it wrong. And by, if you don't want to get it wrong, then often that means you don't do anything, because doing nothing in some respects is no worse than actually doing something and you feel that you might get wrong. And interestingly, in a slightly different way, parallel policy for quite a little while, and still to a degree, we see a similar sort of conditions in the housing industry about how joint arrangements are made, joint bodies are created. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic. But I agree, we're going to need to try and break through that in some ways, and maybe a pilot or an example which is suitably supported and ring fenced might be a way to do it.
Definitely. I would say that's the funding bit, if you like, is the second bit of the house.
Yeah.
As it were.
Yeah.
But then we've got the third bit, which you can touch on, which is probably skills.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think skills is interesting. So we talked about the capability piece, talked about the funding piece. I think skills is fascinating because, even for us as a clean energy champion, with a significant investment program, we want to build transmission distribution networks, wind farms, thermal assets, EV charge points, etc. We can't do any of this if we don't have the supply chain ready to deliver, which comes back to skills. And I think I'm interested in your take, Andrew, as well. But I think for the last bit of the house, skills, the main reflection I had is this is an area where partial devolution, and look, there have been changes since we've had the conversation, with the new government. But I think this is, it's an interesting new case where partial devolution at a national level is a blocker.
Yeah.
A blocker for this, for cities and for mayors to enable places and cities to be that enabler. In particular, I remember the conversation we had with Steve Rotherham in Liverpool. Okay, we've had some partial devolution in things like adult social care, but actually it's that pre and post 16-year piece.
Yes.
And also over things like the apprenticeship levy. And I think what was quite clear in the conversations we had with the college, I remember as well around the table. Elaine, yes. Thanks for reminding me. There was no shortage of pre and post 16-year-olds. And I remember Steve Rotherham bringing their personal work experience with him. There's no shortage of design, of folk who want to work in this sector, and we need that skilled workforce. I I think for us, what is the interesting challenge, and if this, often we've had conversations in Whitehall, and they'll say, "Oh, the demand is not there, the supply chain isn't there," but actually there is a
Yeah.
supply chain there.
Yeah.
But the current framework and current models are meaning that we're not enabling that talent pool, that labour market. And we're not giving them a route in.
No, exactly.
Point one,
Yeah.
but then point two, think about the apprenticeship. There's been some good things, to be clear, from the government of the Clean Energy Jobs Plan, and our team have been heavily involved in those conversations with Des. There's lots of good stuff.
Yeah.
But the root nub of it comes if we want to deliver at pace, and we want to deliver this $33 billion investment program over the next 5 years. What we need, are not just employer provide models, but place-based skills framework, that enable us as an employer to work with mayoral strategic authorities, universities, colleges, develop. What we need is sustainable career pathways
Yes.
at pace.
Yeah.
If I think back to our business, you're under the apprenticeship levy at the moment. It's about 3 to 3.5 years to get an average person to competence.
Yeah.
With the current sort of apprenticeship levy sort of setup, we're having to staff about 30 people to get
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
to administer this
Yeah.
stuff. There has to be a more effective way
Yeah.
to bring down that competence pathway.
Yeah.
So we're not training people up who then go off to do other things because they get bored quite
Yeah.
frankly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But are doing it because they want to and can get into it quickly and get into the job quickly. And I think if I reflect back since our conversation in Liverpool, and obviously you and I have sat around the table with Andy many times, I think he gets that, and that focus on technical academic education, putting both on equal footing. There's I'd say some grounds, some cautious optimism,
No,
I
for
would
sure.
say, but I don't know what you're reflecting.
No, I agree with that. I mean, on the skills issue, I was struck particularly in the conversation we were having in Liverpool around actually very clearly saying that we're having to turn people away, not because we couldn't accommodate them, because we don't have the courses, but we literally, we have a cap on how many we can train at any one time. And that's partly to do with, the way that the funding is structured, never mind the total quantum of funding. And, with flexibility on how the funding is deployed, but also the amount and, reprioritization, reallocation, flex would open up that. I was just struck that there was an opportunity. And particularly what struck me was, that the cohort that we were talking about, were people, as you say, who were not necessarily going through the academic route. It's not like they had two choices in front of them. There was sort of one choice in front of them. And, in a different conversation, whether you then talk about worries around, the NEETs cohort and people not being in education, employment, training, etc., potentially some individuals being more into that potential cohort. And yet there is a ready-made vehicle to help them to get into a career, which, all things being equal, will be an expanding career where more opportunity is created, or in the future, rather than less opportunity. And yet the way that we run these things seems to be a binding constraint, which I think, some of the announcements we've already heard from, the new Prime Minister, particularly around 16 to 19, actually, as you say, give us quite a lot of cautious optimism that actually we can address some of those issues and take away some of those constraints and actually enable businesses to grow, take on the skilled people that they need, and skill them further themselves, and then allow them to develop their careers.
100%. And I think there have been some positive signs through the Milburn report. I think a recognition that this space in the devolution debate has been somewhat fragmented and patchy at best. And actually, if we're going to tackle the crisis of, post 16 years from a skills point of view, and thinking about needs, we need to ensure we do not have a fragmented landscape when it comes to skills devolution. 100%.
No, I agree with that. So come to a close and just think about what next. And you've referred to, we've talked a little bit about, progress has been made on a number of fronts. We talked about, the planning system is more amenable to density than it was, and that allows us to think about how our cities actually, the form and function of our cities.
Yeah.
Transport, we've made quite significant progress in because we've given the mayors extra powers to run the public transport systems. That in itself will have a big energy bonus and boost as a result of that, or emissions implications as well. So there's definite progress has been made, and obviously, new prime minister a month in, making understandably, given he's a former metro mayor, very focused on devolution, recognizing the value that it can bring to unlock and make progress on all these kinds of things. So I'd be interested in just when you think about what you've heard already, and given what we know, you've you referenced, and rightly, Greater Manchester in some instances. There's a lot to build on out of there. Just your grounds for optimism. What do you think? Where do you look and see those grounds for optimism? What is it that gives you hope that we'll make even more rapid progress over the next period?
So I think there's several grounds for optimism. If I reflect on the period since the new government have come in, we have the decision to establish Number 10 North in Manchester. We then, take that, building out, building on, HM Treasury's campus in Darlington, and we've got the Wealth Fund in Leeds. Take this all together, we have a significant shift in the geography of economic policy making, and the cabinet statement, gives, I think, a lot of good meat on the bones of, what are the enablers if we're going to achieve this mission of good growth in every postcode. It's probably quite light on what those opportunities are from an energy perspective.
Yeah.
However, I do have several grounds for optimism. If we take a step back, perhaps to some of your listeners, they might be thinking, well, the energy map of GB and the devolution map don't quite align in the way that transport do. A metro mayor can take a bus under control. However, I think there's probably two opportunities for this government to make cities and places the organising principle for delivering clean energy infrastructure, which is going to be key to driving good growth in every postcode. One is around strategic planning. And so in energy policy, and apologies to your listeners who are perhaps not as familiar with this bit of energy policy, there's probably two bits of strategic planning coming up. So one is this year we have the National Energy Systems Energy Operator. It's going to be coming forward with a spatial strategic energy plan. Now, why does that matter? That matters because that is setting a national picture of how does our energy system connect to things like housing, transport, digital infrastructure, skills. That'll be sitting with the Secretary of State. Now, there's an opportunity there to think about that strategic plan, not as a sort of energy tool in silo, but as a strategic planning tool that could be a real enabler of economic growth. And actually, we have another tool to join this up with. We have regional energy strategic plans, which, if you like, are bottom up, championed actually by our now Prime Minister, that sit with mayoral, which, if you like, are sort of bottom up tools for mayoral strategic authorities, developers, and other stakeholders to provide a bottom up view of what their regional priorities are to feed into that plan. I think for me, what's really interesting is how do we enable these tools to align energy infrastructure, as I say, with local growth priorities in every postcode? I think for me, there's some really exciting opportunities we could tap into there. Then I think the second bit, and we've kind of touched on this earlier with the second bit of the house, as it were, but I do think it's an opportunity if we kind of get that planning piece right. How do we clarify then how public and private collaboration works in practice with regards to funding? We've got GB Energy, we've got the Wealth Fund, we've now got mayoral strategic authorities that are going to be having to take more powers and, if you like, be the delivery agency of the government's growth mission. Well, if government nationally can grasp these strategic planning tools and enable mayors to have some more say at a regional level, then how do we then knit the funding architecture at a regional level as well? So the role of public finance institutions, mayoral strategic authorities, and then we touched on earlier the role of public policy in giving those test beds for different types of funding models to cooperate with the private sector. Is it grant funding? Is it co-investment? Is it shared asset? Procurement framework? Does it differ for solar arrays to EV charging points to a district heat network or other bits of infrastructure. I think for me, these two things, strategic planning and public-private collaboration over funding, I think are opportunities. And why do they matter? If we then zoom back to where we went at the beginning of the conversation, we're at a key bit in the energy transition now where we need to keep customers, communities on side, show that this transition, as if we're going to electrify the economy, that is the surest route. And I'll give a plug for our an SSE affordability report we published over the last month that shows that renewables and electrification is the optimal pathway for citizens and businesses to enjoy the lower bills that this infrastructure can provide. Those two opportunities, if we do these right, ultimately those two things then feed through to enabling customers and communities feeling the benefits of the transition. And this came up time and time again in every conversation. Those outcomes that are important.
Absolutely.
In the argument, it's reduced bills, cleaner air, and skilled workers. The things on the doorstep. They've got to feel these benefits have got to feel practical and affordable. And ultimately, if we can invest, it's a virtuous circle. And enablers then cities really to become the engine rooms of clean economic growth in every postcode. So I think there's grounds for optimism, but let's see as we move through the funnel.
Yes.
The interesting times ahead.
Indeed. Well, I think that's both grounds for a good place to finish on, the sort of grounds for optimism, but also a real stress, which is I think we've emphasized throughout, and it certainly came through in the work that we did 2 years ago and the subsequent work we've done when we've gone different parts of the country talking to people. It is about, yes, you can never not have to make the argument about why we should do this, and repetition and continuous repetition is part and parcel of that. But actually, we're definitely at a phase where we're really thinking about the how to deliver this, in what way, at what scale, at what pace. That's where a lot of the conversation and the debate is now at the local level, at the cities level. They've gone well beyond the why should we do this and should we do this even. And I think that is where we ideally want to be. And I think cities, as you say, have a role both in making sure that the momentum is not lost in sometimes national debates and discussions, but actually begins to show how it can be done. And that in itself creates the confidence, creates the track record, creates the momentum. So I think it's a fascinating time. And as you've said, we have a leadership at the national level that gets all of this stuff, in some respects, has led on a lot of this stuff at the local level. So further grounds for optimism. My guest today has been Jaz. Jaz, thanks for being part of City Talks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of City Talks, brought to you by the Centre for Cities. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Podbean by searching Centre for Cities. Please rate and subscribe if you liked what you heard. You can follow the Centre on Twitter at Centre for Cities, all one word, or on LinkedIn for the latest on what the Centre is up to. To hear about all our latest reports and briefings and upcoming events, sign up to our fortnightly newsletter via our website, centreforcities.org. If you have any comments on the episode or suggestions for topics we should cover, we'd love to hear from you. Do tweet us or send us an email to info@centreforcities.org.